Is Swedish a difficult language to learn? This is a question that if you ask many different people, you will probably get many different answers. And it's a question that I get a lot of times by people that want to move to Sweden or want to learn the Swedish language, especially after updating you all about my journey learning Swedish as an American on this channel. I recently posted my 3-year in Sweden speaking Swedish on camera video, and a lot of people were impressed with my progress and my ability to speak Swedish fluently. So with that, I wanted to address this big misconception that Swedish is a very, very difficult language to learn. And I also want to talk about why Swedish actually is difficult for a lot of people. Now, first and foremost, I did some research on what are actually the easiest and most difficult languages to learn for English speakers. Now, Babbel.com published an article titled "The 9 Easiest Languages for English Speakers to Learn." The most easy language for English speakers to learn was actually Norwegian. It goes into detail about having a very easy grammar structure and also having a lot of similar words to English. And if you know anything about how closely related Swedish and Norwegian are, then it should come as no surprise to you that Swedish is actually listed as the second easiest language to learn for English speakers, according to this article. Other languages on this list that were extremely easy for English speakers to learn are lots of Romance languages like Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, and then also some more Germanic languages that are similar to Swedish, Norwegian, Dutch, those types of languages. Now, just for confirmation, I wanted to do a little bit of extra research as well, and on this website, SwedishMadeEasy.com, it categorizes languages into 3 groups based on their difficulty to learn as English speakers. The first group, or the easy group, includes Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, all of these Romance types of languages, as I was just saying, but also some of these Germanic languages like Dutch, Swedish, Afrikaans, and Norwegian. The reason why these languages are considered to be easy is because they are closely related to English. And according to this infographic, a native English speaker can reach proficiency in one of these easier languages in as little as 23 to 24 weeks. Now, just to give you guys some contrast versus easy language and harder languages to learn, in the medium category, you had things like Hindi, Russian, Vietnamese, Turkish, Polish, Thai. These types of languages all have significant differences from English. And then if you go to the hard category, these are totally different. This is like Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. According to this, to reach proficiency in a language in the difficult or hard category can take 4 times as long as it does to reach proficiency in Swedish or Norwegian, for example. So what are some characteristics of Swedish that make it easy and difficult to learn? Well, for one thing, the grammar in Swedish I find to be extremely easy. As somebody who has studied German in the past and who has grown up with German family on my dad's side, I really know how difficult grammar can be in a language. Swedish grammar, on the other hand, I personally find to be a breeze. For one thing, in Sweden, people do not conjugate verbs like you do in English or German. So if you learn one form of the verb, it will work for pretty much everything. Just take the verb to be. In English, we have I am, you are, he, she, it is. Just for those 3 different things, depending on the subject of the sentence, we use 3 different forms of the verb. In Swedish, regardless of the subject of the sentence, they always have the same form of the verb. For example, jag är, du är, vi är, ni är. Every single one. If you just learn the verb are, it works for you, me, he, she, it, we, us. And without having to conjugate verbs, that makes life extremely easy. Now, one thing in Swedish that is more difficult than English, but on the other hand, way easier than German, is the different forms of the word the. In English, for example, we use the for pretty much whatever noun: the dog, the house, the kitchen. You can just say the for everything. In German, on the other hand, it can be extremely difficult because they have 3 different forms of the word the. You have the masculine, der, you have the feminine, die, and you have the neuter form, das. So whatever the noun is in German, you basically have a 33% chance of getting the correct article right in front of it. This is extremely tough if you're not a native speaker of German to always use the correct form for the noun that you're speaking about. Whereas in Swedish, it's a little bit more difficult than English in this aspect, but still way, way easier than German. In Swedish, we have 2 forms, en and et. Now, actually, in the very, very old Nordic languages, they used to have 3 forms, just like they do in German, which they still have in Icelandic, I believe. But in Swedish, they combine both the masculine and the feminine into one article, en, which is the common article, and then we have the neuter, which is et. This makes it much easier when you have only 2 versus 3 in German. And also, if you're not really sure in Swedish what the article is, a good rule of thumb is about 80% of the time it's en. So if you guess en, you're going to be more likely right than you are wrong. Versus in German, if you don't know, you're going to be wrong 2/3 of the time. When I was learning Swedish, basically I just tried to remember what the et nouns were, and for everything else, I just assumed it was en. And this is something that you pick up naturally over time, the more time that you spend in the country. Now, one thing in Swedish that can be tough to get used to in the beginning, but it becomes extremely easy once you get used to it, is when you say the something, like you would say in English or in German, der, dir, das, space, whatever the noun is. In Swedish, they actually put this article attached to the word at the end. So take, for example, in English, you would say the dog. In German, that translation would be der Hund. If it's der. I'm still guessing about that. In Swedish though, the article gets attached to the end of the word. So if you want to say the dog, it becomes hunden. If you say en hund, that would be translated to a dog. Whereas English and German have separate words for a and the. And like I said, this can be a little bit trippy when you're first learning Swedish as an English speaker, but it becomes very second nature once you start to come in with the language. And pretty much every language is gonna have their quirks to deal with. Now let's talk about a few of the more difficult aspects that I found in my Swedish language journey. For one thing, the Swedish language can tend to break the rules a lot more often than, say, German, for example, which is very, very strict, structured grammar. It can be tough to learn in the beginning, but once you have that structure, it's usually going to hold firm for most of the language, whereas Swedish can have a tendency to break some rules sometimes. And I didn't really study the grammar heavily when I was learning Swedish. I basically just picked it up from speaking it with students or speaking it with Swedish colleagues, and then just hearing what was right. And then after years of making your own mistakes and hearing how other people say things, it gradually just gets better over time. But for me, the most difficult aspect of Swedish still to this day is pronunciation. Now, the Swedish language has 3 additional letters compared to the English alphabet. The 3 letters at the end of the Swedish alphabet are basically the vowels that have the funny circles and dots. And even after 3 years here, I can still have some difficulties pronouncing these, but the most difficult thing for me to pronounce in Swedish is the R, because the R sound in Swedish makes a different sound than what we would do in English. And growing up, having learned some German when I was younger, I can pronounce the much more harsh version of the R, whereas it's almost more of like a Spanish R where it just rolls off the tongue in Swedish. That's very, very difficult for me to pronounce. But also in some regions of Sweden, like the south of Sweden, their R will be pronounced a little bit more like the way that I can pronounce my R. So I think if I were to live in the south of Sweden, I might be able to blend in with my accent just a little bit easier. So this video might seem counterintuitive to a lot of people because so many people find Swedish so difficult to learn. And so many people have lived in Sweden for so long, years and years and years, and not learned Swedish. Whereas if you go to Spain or if you go to Germany, most of the people that move to those countries tend to learn the language very, very quickly. So it's kind of counterintuitive. Why? I mean, based on these articles, it looks like Swedish is considered to be one of the easier languages to learn. So why is it that people have such a hard time learning Swedish when they move here? And this is a very, very, very simple answer for me, and that is the fact that people in Sweden speak such amazing English. When you move to Sweden as an English speaker, you basically can function completely well in Swedish society without speaking a word of Swedish. And this can be both a blessing and a curse. Because when you first move here as an English speaker, your life is so much easier than it would be if you moved to a country like France or Spain or Germany, where there's less people in society that speak perfect English. But in terms of learning the language, this can be a huge, huge setback, a huge hindrance. And it really separates people, because if you want to become fluent in Swedish, you have to push yourself. You have to put yourself outside of that safe, out of the comfort zone of speaking English. And this is something that's easy to fall into for a lot of people. If I need to have a serious conversation with somebody at the tax office or with a doctor or somebody on the phone, for me, even as somebody that speaks fluent Swedish, I always know that it's an option that I can just speak my native language and they'll speak back to me in almost perfect English. And when you don't have to use Swedish, it makes it very, very difficult to learn because you're not pushing yourself. You can always fall back on your native English language. One of the biggest advantages I had when it came to learning Swedish was working with kids in schools, because if I were to have worked in a job around all adults in Sweden have extremely good English, and even kids for the most part speak impressive levels of English. But for me, I mean, my first job in Sweden, I was working with kids as young as in the 4th grade. And when you're working with kids that are only 10 years old, it's obvious that their English is not going to be as developed as a full adult Swede. So for me, actually, I think it was hugely advantageous to work with people at work who didn't have the same level of English as somebody that would to move here and work in a startup or work as an engineer or something where they're working with older Swedes that can speak perfect English. But regardless of the field you go into and where you're working, that's the secret to becoming fluent in Swedish, is to actually push yourself, actually force yourself to speak the language, and then you will get better. Because on paper, Swedish is actually not that difficult of a language to learn. It's actually one of the easiest languages to learn. But the fact that everybody here speaks such great English, that's the real challenge. That's the real challenge, because you have to take the responsibility to push yourself on your own, because if you don't, you'll still be able to function perfectly normally with your life here in Sweden. If you want some more tips on learning Swedish, I've made several videos about learning Swedish that are already on my channel. In fact, my first ever video that I posted on my channel was some of those tips that I was using to learn the Swedish language. So you're welcome to check out some of those earlier videos for some of my tips. If you have any more questions, go ahead and write those down in the comments section. And if you want to see more of my videos, don't forget to subscribe and even maybe press that notification bell if you want to be notified when I post more. And I'm super excited. We just crossed 80,000 subscribers on the channel. It's always been my goal to get to 100 and get one of those plaques that you get on the wall. So if you're enjoying my content and you want to see more, press that subscribe button. I really would appreciate it, and I love this community that we've been able to build here. But with that being said, thanks for watching this one, and I'll see you guys in the next video.